I grew up reading comics. I loved them. I loved the action, the drama, the artwork, and the stories, but most of all, I loved the characters. These larger-than-life personas going toe-to-toe with some of the world's most sinister fictional villains, but at the turn of a page, found themselves dealing with the same problems you or I may experience on any given day. I lived for these stories as a young boy, and one of my personal favorites was Marvel's Spider-Man. I recall my middle school years walking to school each day, where I would stop at a local newsstand 3 days a week and use my lunch money to buy the latest from the Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man, and Spectacular Spider-Man comic book runs. A few days without unappetizing school lunches was the necessary sacrifice to support my reading and follow along with the web-slinger's latest adventures. It wouldn't be until later years, looking back, that I would realize the importance these books had in my young life, providing more than just an escape or merely entertaining my itch for the fantastical. Spider-Man served as a guide in many ways, a role model, as silly as that may sound. In these comics, Spider-Man was just a young man, not much older than myself. He faced many of the same types of problems in his personal life and seemed to have the worst luck in the world. Many times he would face overwhelming obstacles, both as Spider-Man and as Peter Parker. But no matter what was in his way, Peter always persisted, intent on doing what's right, even when it may be the most difficult. Spider-Man, with all of his imperfections, was a representation of what many of us, myself included, aspired to be. Not a superhero per se, so much as a good man. A message that rings through so loudly in Spider-Man No Way Home, it brought a much older me to tears. Of all the Spider-Man adventures we've seen on the big screen, none of them have captured the character from the pages, much like the more recent Marvel Spider-Man trilogy. While the Raimi trilogy will always hold a special place in my heart for being the first time I got to see my favorite character on screen, my affinity for these films has undergone some metamorphosis over the years. I still appreciate them, but it's obvious that these films are Raimi's interpretation of the character more so than an accurate depiction of the character in the source material that I know and love. The Andrew Garfield films certainly had their share of problems with production and writing, but I would still argue that Andrew Garfield is hands down the most accurate depiction of the Stan Lee Ditko era of young Peter Parker, a loner who was bullied only to seek opportunities to return the favor in full when he gets the chance. None of these films, however, have quite captured the persona and heart of the character, quite like the Jon Watts trilogy. Over the course of 3 movies, Jon Watts tells the tale of a young Peter Parker grappling with the struggles of being a teenager with the added complexity of the powers Peter has acquired and, likewise, the problems that arise as a result. We watch as Peter starts off desperately seeking the approval of his idol, only to later find himself in the shadow of the very person he looked up to. Peter is left facing the internal conflict of living up to the expectations of others, while simultaneously struggling more and more with his own identity and self-worth. Through all of this, Peter emerges with a refined sense of self, content with being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and embracing his life as Peter Parker. As Spider-Man, he can continue to help others and act as the hero for the everyday man, which is all he really wants at the end of the day. As Peter, he can have the life he's wanted, and for so long, but was out of reach and undeserved. Those closest to him now know his secret, and for the first time, Peter feels content, relieved of the burden of keeping secrets from those he cares for most. This is, of course, in perfect Spider-Man style, short-lived.
Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker!
Peter, the boy, still has some valuable lessons to learn on his path to becoming the man. In No Way Home, Jon Watts' third entry into the trilogy, we start off with the rug being pulled out from under Peter. J. Jonah Jameson, by way of Mysterio's video, reveals to the world that Spider-Man is actually 17-year-old Peter Parker. For but a moment, Peter had everything he ever wanted, and just like that, it was all taken away. The boy, who only just found his place in the world and accepted it, now faces his entire world being flipped on its head. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only thing Peter can do at this point is face his new reality. Certainly not an ideal circumstance, and creates plenty of opportunity for further complications in his life, but perhaps Peter can come to terms with his predicament. What he can't live with, however, is the impact he sees this revelation having on the lives of those he loves. When Peter sees what repercussions are in store for MJ, Ned, and the other people in his life, simply for being associated with him, it becomes too much. Living with his own actions is one thing, but seeing his identity as Spider-Man have real-world consequences for others makes him desperate, and his attempts to right wrongs is overcompensated, ultimately making the problem at hand even worse. One final lesson must be learned before the boy can become a man, and in turn, live up to his potential as the hero. When Peter faces the reality that not only are his antics as Spider-Man costing him the future he had hoped for himself, but the futures of MJ and Ned as well, it's too much for him to bear. Seeing the disappointment in their eyes only to be expressed verbally with their continued love and support for Peter weighs too heavy on his conscience. Peter is desperate to fix this for his friends and once again, in typical teenage fashion, jumps to the most extreme measure to attempt to course correct. Seeking the aid of Stephen Strange, Peter hopes to undo recent events and make the world forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. A desperate measure with such little planning, the thought to contact the admissions office and appeal their decision hadn't even crossed his mind. This isn't entirely unbelievable, given his age and Peter's propensity for unwittingly making a bad situation worse before it gets better, but if I had one critique of this film, however minuscule, it would be around this part of the film. Specifically with Doctor Strange mirroring the same teenage recklessness and lack of preparation. One would think that before casting a spell that brainwashes the entire planet, Strange would take a beat to discuss the ins and outs with Peter, or at the very least lay out some parameters for the spell. Instead, Strange jumps into action, causing Peter to frantically try to apply those parameters during the casting of the spell and ultimately, unknowingly, causing the modifications necessary to bring villains and even other Spider-Men into this reality. The problems Peter sought to fix just got more complicated.
Peter!
Yeah? Oh, sorry. Did you mean
that? Peter.
we're all called Peter, Peter.
Peter
Yeah.
Parker?
Same again, we're all Peter Parker.
Now, I admit, I was a little concerned through my excitement after hearing that they'd be bringing villains in from older Spider-Man films. Mostly, I'm sure, credited to what happened with Raimi's Spider-Man 3 and the amount of characters in that film. A choice that led to a lack of development, never mind that awful version of Venom that was forced into the film at Sony's insistence. I have to say, I think Webb and Marvel handled this well, however. The appearances served far more than nostalgia bait or cameos. They even serve far beyond plot devices for the film itself and go so far as to add closure for the characters themselves and the Spider-Men whose universes they're from. The same applies to the Spider-Men as well, seeing Tobey and Andrew standing side by side with Holland. 3 Spider-Men standing there together on screen was something I never knew I needed. That young boy still somewhere deep inside was bursting with joy. These additions each serve their own fundamental purpose, and we see that through the bond formed between the 3 Peters, learning from one another, each growing a little in some way from the experience. The 2 older Spider-Men serve as a means to guide our young Peter Parker. They've experienced unparalleled loss, each in their own way, and through it all, persisted in their quest to do what's right and to stand up for those who can't stand for themselves. We learned how Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man struggled after the events of his final film. How he stopped pulling his punches, becoming bitter and detached following the loss of his Gwen Stacy, a path he desperately wants to prevent our Peter from falling down. Likewise, we learn that Tobey's Spider-Man has lived his life to a point where he's found some sense of stability and happiness, contrasting Andrew's experience, but not before wrestling with his own demons. Demons he too hopes he can spare Holland's Spider-Man. Each of these heroes have had their own experiences, even when they're ever so similar. But through it all, they share the same foundation, and it's from that foundation that Holland's Peter Parker will find his answers and, in turn, his future. It was that very foundation that guided Peter's instinct to do what's right in an effort to free his friends from the consequences of his actions that led to the problem at hand. It wasn't his actions that were necessarily the problem to begin with, at the very least, not the motive behind them. Peter knew this, but his own self-doubt, coupled with the cost he saw being paid by those he loved, blinded him to that reality. Peter has always acted with the best intentions, but it was the consequences of those actions, however unfair, that he needed to consider. Much like the choice between sending the villains back to their universes to die or try to cure them and give them a chance before sending them back, it comes down to the right choice over the easy choice. Peter could easily wipe his hands of this mess and send them back. Problem solved. It's not his problem after all. But you see, that's just not who he is. That's not who Spider-Man is. Something that he's reminded of over the course of the movie from Aunt May and the other Peters. We see the boy taking his first steps into becoming the man, but not before this foundation is put to the ultimate test.
Tragedy. What else can I call it? What more need be said? The damage, the destruction, you saw it with your own eyes. When will people wake up and realize that everywhere Spider-Man goes, chaos and calamity ensue? Everything Spider-Man touches comes to ruin. And we, the innocents, are left to pick up the pieces.
Losing someone you care about can be earth-shattering for anyone, particularly when it's someone who plays a pinnacle role in your life. Often, it leaves many questions unanswered, and most certainly makes somewhat of a large impact on your daily life following that loss. And while loss is not a unique topic to Spider-Man, the format in which Marvel chose to tell this telling of the character certainly provided a unique opportunity for Peter's evolution in the MCU. The loss of Aunt May at the hands of Green Goblin came swiftly and without remorse. We see Peter looking over Aunt May in disbelief, breaking apart from the inside, knowing all too well that her death is a direct consequence of his actions that brought the Green Goblin into his universe. And worse, there was nothing he could do. This scene was heartbreaking and a solid payoff for Marvel's decision to forego the Uncle Ben story we've seen so many times already, while still serving as a pivotal moment in Peter's journey to becoming the man and the hero that he has the potential to be. Following May's death, Peter struggles with his guilt and grief with the guidance and help from his friends, including some new faces as he's introduced to the Spider-Man of other universes. Toby and Andrew remind Peter that May's death isn't for nothing, relating their stories of Uncle Ben and how they continue his legacy by being the best Spider-Man they can be. Seeing them mentor the young Holland was all I could ask for in a film like this. Watching the trio come together to do what they do and help cure the sinister selection of villains created a fantastic third act of the film, leading to a satisfying standoff between a rage-filled Holland and Green Goblin, before Toby steps in once more to guide Peter and protect him from going down the path like he once did. That internal rage festering and boiling beneath the surface, only to be egged on by Green Goblin's taunts. This was the true adversary of the battle for Peter, one that, with a little help from some friends, he ultimately defeats. The battle isn't over for Holland's Peter Parker, however. Having cured the otherworldly villains, the problem of space-time still persists, and Peter has to make the ultimate sacrifice, sealing his fate and venturing into the unknown, alone. To undo the problems created by his previous attempts to make the world forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, the world must forget Peter Parker. And so, with a nod of respect and a good bit of sadness in his eyes, Dr. Strange begins weaving his spell as Peter gives one last goodbye to his Spider Bros before turning to his best friend and the girl he loves. It's a heart-wrenching goodbye as MJ pleads for another plan, a remarkable performance by Zendaya and Holland. They say their final goodbyes and they kiss, before Peter turns and leaps from the edge, almost as a metaphor for that last step off from what was into what will be. Peter is entirely alone now. The world has forgotten Peter Parker. Everyone he knew and loved, but a memory for only his keeping. To them, he's nothing more than a stranger now. Peter visits the coffee shop where MJ works, planning to try to spark her memory and explain their past. But upon seeing that MJ and Ned were accepted into the schools that his relationships with them had previously compromised, he pauses. Peter notices the bandage above MJ's eye, recognizing his responsibility in the events that caused her harm. Perhaps they're better off now, their futures uncompromised. That's all Peter ever wanted for them. He changes his mind, and he says his goodbyes. Coffee in hand, he leaves the coffee shop. The world may have forgotten Peter Parker, but for the first time, Peter Parker knows himself. And now, after everything that's happened, Peter will carry on, doing what he does. Not because he needs validation, not to meet expectations, because that's what Spider-Man does, but because that's who Peter Parker is. That's what the man he's growing into stands for. Doing what's right, no matter the sacrifice. Spider-Man No Way Home was a great movie and served as the perfect bookend to the trilogy. This trilogy of films has been my personal favorite among the Spider-Man films, in part largely to the respect it shows to the origins of the character during the Lee Ditko era and leading into the college years for Peter Parker. Each movie serving as an introductory chapter in Parker's life and laying the foundations for the man he'll become. I'm truly excited to see where they go from here if Holland continues into more standalone Spider-Man films. Tom Holland was made for this role, and his enthusiasm for the character shines through. I certainly hope we get to see more of Peter's journey, wherever the future may take him. But what did you think? Did Did you like No Way Home? What was your favorite movie in the Marvel trilogy? Let me know in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. But that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this analysis/review of Spider-Man No Way Home. If you did, it'd mean a lot to me if you drop a like to support the video. I put a lot of time into these videos and the support definitely helps. And if this is your first time catching one of my videos and you'd like to see more, click that subscribe button and join the 330 something others. I look forward to seeing you back here next time. But regardless, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care out there, friends. I'll see you soon.